So where are the opportunities for strengthening ties in the hemisphere to the benefit of both the United States and individual countries inside the hemisphere?
When President Biden came into office, there was hope for a reset in U.S. Latin American relations, particularly with the rise of left-leaning governments across the region, a movement often called the pink tide. But despite that optimism, the shift many were expecting hasn't really taken hold.
And we should recognize the complexity of the political environment we're dealing with. We don't try to put all European governments into a box. Let's not do the same with Latin America.
With another U.S. election coming up in November, the next administration, whoever it may be, will have to reassess how it approaches Latin America. What is the state of these relationships today?
Mexico has become the biggest single trading partner of the United States.
What key moments have shaped them? And what are the opportunities for deeper engagement?
So the opportunities are there. Whether they'll be seized is another question.
This is Global Insights by Network 2020. Today, the future of U.S. policy in Latin America. Today, we're joined by Ambassador P. Michael McKinley, a four-time U.S. ambassador to Peru, Colombia, Afghanistan, and Brazil. Moderating the conversation is Courtney Doggart, president of Network 2020. The first question, for which the audio was unfortunately lost, is how has the Biden administration approached relations with Latin America? And what have been the key aspects of its strategy?
Well, thank you. It is a big question, and it's in the context of obviously an election campaign. And I think it's important to take a step back and look at what has happened over most of the last 4 years and do the compare and contrast with the policies that were pursued by the Trump administration between 2017 and 2021. The broader context is a Latin America that during the 2000s and into the 2010s had an unprecedented growth spurt in which tens of millions of people were lifted out of poverty. Middle classes across the region grew by the tens of millions. The region as a whole benefited from the commodity boom of the 2000s. That's when oil prices soared, but also demand for other inputs into industrial processes and construction and food supplies, largely from China, but from many other parts of the world as well. And there was a very significant economic transformation underway in the region. And it was also a period when the United States, under both Republican and Democratic administrations, pursued free trade agreements with Latin America. Commodity boom came to an end in 2013. Economic growth in the region slowed. A region which since the 1990s had been almost entirely democratic began to see some of the same challenges in governance that we've seen in other parts of the world. And there was a shift to more populist and nationalist leaders, and certainly a sense of a more uncertain future as the prospects of continued strong economic growth began to dry up. In 2017, with the election of President Trump, there was also a shift in the optic of how the United States dealt with the region, in which, given that administration's decision to focus on national economic security, looking inward, and on reshoring American investments and industry overseas back to the United States, much less of an emphasis on the economic ties with Latin America, and certainly no commitment to negotiating any further free trade agreements. It was a period when left-wing governments began to be elected in the region, which also conditioned and colored attitudes in Washington, concerned also about the growing influence of China as China became increasingly the largest trading partner, particularly for countries in South America. And as certainly tensions grew with left-leaning governments, authoritarian governments that were building in both Nicaragua and Venezuela. And finally, because of the Trump administration's singular focus on migration to the United States, which during that period certainly saw increasing numbers of people from the region looking to emigrate to the United States as irregular migrants or through legal means, and certainly raising tensions and concerns inside the United States that weren't entirely just the concern of the Trump administration, but of Americans more broadly. So the Biden administration came in, and it was with the COVID pandemic underway, and with the region undergoing yet another economic downturn. Latin America, with 8% of the world's population, suffered 30% of global COVID deaths. The economies suffered accordingly, and predictions were pretty widespread that Latin America would take a decade to recover economically from the impact of the COVID pandemic. And so the Biden administration came in with a very different approach, which was to rebuild a sense of partnership with the hemisphere, to re-strengthen multilateral institutions like the World Bank, UN agency operations inside the region, assist with development funding for areas like Central America, which were generating many of the migrants to the United States, working on transnational concerns like climate change, and yes, focused on the growing challenge from China in a host of sectors, and moving towards a policy reflecting, I think, the approach to many other parts of the world of accepting that there would be different forms of government that weren't always necessarily aligned with how the United States viewed the world, but looking for areas of cooperation. Over the last 3.5+ years, however, other issues kicked in. And we can talk about Ukraine. We can talk about more recently the conflict in Israel, Gaza, and now Lebanon. Talk about the growing concern about China, South China Seas, Indo-Pacific. But the long and short of it is Biden administration efforts to build up a new and forward-looking set of ties with the region faced headwinds, particularly priorities that were more urgent for U.S. national security in other parts of the world. So as we take measure of what was accomplished, I think there's a better dialogue again with Latin America, less defensive relationship with the region, but still very much work in progress in which economic ties with Latin America have not been strengthened strategically. The opportunities that were there to increase work on climate change haven't been fully seized, still with a problem of a very significant migration to the United States, and still with issues of authoritarian states in Venezuela and Nicaragua causing tensions in the hemisphere. So the balance sheet, I think, is mixed. And we're going to really, over the next few weeks and really until inauguration, have to wait and see what the next stage of attempted ties with Latin America will be. Final point is Latin America has been a secondary concern for the United States for decades, and only surfaces as a concern when there's issues, problems, political crises, or something that impacts the United States more directly. But here's what's been most interesting over the last 3 to 4 years, I'd say the last 10 years, but let's just take this period. It's still the region of the world that impacts the United States and American citizens most directly on an everyday basis. Whether you're focused on migration, whether you're focused on the fentanyl crisis, whether you're focused on the whole debate on nearshoring and reshoring and dealing with China, Mexico has become the biggest single trading partner of the United States. And nobody would have predicted that 4 years ago, but an indication of how integrated we are with at least our nearest neighbor in Latin America and the potential for integration more broadly throughout the region. And certainly as we address questions like climate change and the issue of the challenge of Chinese, frankly, significant economic weight in every region of the world, Latin America is also important for another reason: rare earths and critical minerals. Inputs into the new economy, the digital economy, the green energy transition, electrical vehicles, lithium batteries, and so on. It's also, with the United States, the region of the world most likely to deal with climate change in terms of food production and become an important supplier for the world more broadly. So the opportunities are there. Whether they'll be seized is another question.
Thank you for that. It is interesting how often we in the United States tend to look to Europe, let's say, as sort of that nearest partner, whereas there's so much right on our own continent. And we just did an event about this with the USMCA and looking at North America maybe about a month or so ago. And it was fascinating. And it just underscored, I think, the need to look in our own backyard as well and do more here. I'd like to dig into something that you alluded to in that very wonderful arc that you laid out, which is the political landscape in Latin America. And you referenced the incoming governments, a lot of left-leaning governments, the so-called pink tide, as well as authoritarian governments that the United States also needs to contend with. So how, in your mind, has this political landscape shaken out? Is the term pink tide an apt one, or are there lessons that we can draw if you look more closely at how the political landscape in Latin America is evolving?
So I'm going to take to heart that what some of our participants have already said. They don't know much necessarily about the region. Let me backtrack and just say, in the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, Latin America was a region that was very much seen through the prisms of the Cold War, the ideological conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States, and where the focus was less on democracies and more on governments, whether they were with the United States or supportive of an alliance or a close relationship with the Soviet Union. That period, we had close ties with many military dictatorships, with personalized dictatorships that were right of center or not aligned with the Soviet Union, or countries, Cuba in particular, aligned with the Soviet Union, a great deal of concern whether that was a springboard for spreading communism throughout Central America and so on. With the end of the Cold War in 1989, just like in the rest of the world, there's an explosion of democracies. Globally, throughout the 1990s, you literally have dozens upon dozens of democracies added, 20 plus in Europe, in Central Asia, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, but also throughout most of Latin America. And I think by the beginning of the 2000s, we were down to one government in the entire hemisphere of 34 countries that was not a democracy, and that was Cuba. Every other country in the hemisphere was a democracy. Across the 2000s into the early 2010s, they were democracies in which left of center got elected, right of center got elected. But pretty much the democratic process was easily recognizable across the region, with parties changing power peacefully without too many sort of tensions. There were exceptions, obviously, in the period, especially when there were severe economic crises like we saw in Argentina in the early 2000s. But generally speaking, there was an assumption that Latin America was not only becoming more democratic, but democracy was consolidating. So we moved into that period after 2013 when the commodity boom ended, economic growth slowed. Latin America is one of the slowest growing regions of the world, if not the slowest, over the last 10 years. Political tensions naturally grew, and Latin America, like the United States, like Europe, like other parts of the world, saw growth in populist nationalist politicians, political movements that had different views on how to address the problems of changing economies, stagnant economies, states where there was fear of the future. And I think we can speak of dozens of countries around the world. It's not just a feature that was evident inside Latin America. And by the end of the 2010s, people were speaking about a pink tide, which was the election of left wing, not just left of center, left wing governments in Latin America that were seen as a challenge to what the United States and Latin America as a region had developed over the previous 20, 25 years, which was this sort of centrist democracies that largely agreed on the direction societies needed to take to develop. And in that context, there was great concern in Washington because you had left of center governments elected in Chile, in Colombia, in Brazil, you had Honduras. There was already a left of center government in Argentina, a government in Venezuela, the left wing growing authoritarian state there continued to consolidate itself, and so on. And there was this sense that this shift to the left meant away from the United States was the future of Latin American politics and could indicate also a growing approximation or closeness to strategic adversaries of the United States, Russia or China, and so on, and growing influence of Cuba again. Well, the fact of the matter is, in democracies, there's pendulum swings, and situations get rough. And I would again point to our own country. You have more extremist political discussions happened in Latin America. It didn't mean these countries were turning more authoritarian or necessarily ideologically turning away from the United States. And lo and behold, within about 3 years from the million articles written about the pink tide, in 21, 22, we began to see centrist and right of center governments being elected in Argentina, in Ecuador, in Peru, and so on. And more importantly, looking at the left of center governments, some of them look suspiciously like social democratic governments in Europe in terms of policies they pursued. Responsible macroeconomic policies, bringing down the outsized budget deficits that were spent to support the population during the COVID pandemic. Respect for democratic processes. And so when we're looking at Latin America, I think it's very important to remember that there is a consolidation of democratic process, not necessarily so much of democratic institutions in certain countries. And we should recognize the complexity of the political environment we're dealing with. And so at the moment, we have a mix of left, centrist, and right of center governments. We have three openly authoritarian states in Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. And generally speaking, a region that's still trying to find its way forward economically to resume the kind of economic growth that we saw in the late 90s into the 2000s, which seemed to be lifting their populations, creating opportunities, transforming their economies. And that's what governments are largely responding to now. What I'm trying to suggest here is we don't try to put all European governments into a box. Let's not do the same with Latin America.
Great point. On the economic front, I'd like to stay there for a little bit. You referenced that the need to have that economic pick up again. when it comes to the U.S., how can the U.S. leverage economic opportunities to deepen its ties with countries in Latin America? And what positive steps can be taken to overcome any regional economic challenges? And one final thought that I would just tack on there is, where do you see the most, the best prospects for deepening those economic opportunities, particularly when it comes to things like nearshoring?
So I'm going to give an opinion which is not necessarily shared by everybody who works on Latin America and looks at the economic ties between the region and the United States. Essentially, we have a global economy that is substantially transformed over the last 20 years. And so the idea that the United States is going to be a dominant actor and condition or lead the way for any region of the world, I think, is increasingly out of date. Latin America right now includes the 8th or 9th largest economy in the world, which is Brazil, the 11th or 13th largest economy in the world, which is Mexico, one of the top 20 or 25 economies in the world, which is Argentina. In other words, these are countries that are large, significant actors, what are called in the parlance these days the growing middle powers of international affairs, the middle emerging economies that increasingly have sway, make decisions that impact others, just as the decisions others make impact them. They're not looking for necessarily formalized trade agreements with the United States, with the exception of Mexico, which has one since the 1990s, and are looking for the kind of trading relationship, investment relationship with the United States, which we're seeing develop, whether it's in the Indo-Pacific, whether it's with Europe, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's with India, and so on. That said, Courtney, you've raised a very important point. The United States is still the largest trading and investment partner for the region. Now, a lot of that is because of the outsized weight of the United States in the Mexican economy and our investments in Mexico. But the United States is a significant actor for other economies. And even where we're second to China, we're second on trade, but we're largely first on investment inside these economies. Now, a person from my background, I came up believing free trade was a good thing, and trade agreements were a good thing, and globalization was a good thing. And I'll stick by it, but that's not the subject today. But times move on. Globalization has changed radically, and we're not going back to lots of new trade agreements negotiated. So where are the opportunities for strengthening ties in the hemisphere to the benefit of both the United States and individual countries inside the hemisphere? We're seeing it already with Mexico, in which a middle income, not a poor country, a middle income country, which is what Mexico is, has extraordinarily sophisticated level of manufacturing that provides inputs and synergies with everything from vehicle production to airplane production to computer production inside the United States. It doesn't just supply us with agricultural or mineral products or inputs. And as we look at this changing global landscape, Mexico is increasingly important as an alternative for growing consensus in the United States that it's better to not depend so much on China to provide certain exports to the United States. And for those who believe, whether it comes from China or somewhere else, it's important to diversify. And so Mexico and Canada are taking on different level of importance. As we look at the Dominican Republic, Panama, and Costa Rica, they're positioning themselves to be recipients of incoming investment for this reshoring. Costa Rica, for example, with the semiconductors. The Panama's emerging as it has emerged as a financial center and services economy, and if we take a look at countries like Brazil and Argentina, it's not that that the relationships have been fully built out. They have not been, but the relationship between Brazil, Argentina, and the United States and Canada on agricultural production to feed the world could be very significant going forward. There's also the issue of critical minerals. And Latin America has over 60%, 70% of the world's lithium supplies, of copper production. Increasingly, deposits of critical rare earths are being found. Chinese are already investing, but there's a growing interest of American companies and certainly of the United States to see a Western orientation in that investment in critical industries that provide inputs to the United States. And finally, on climate change, there's no question that Latin America, in the case of, I think it's the region with, I think after Sub-Saharan Africa, the lowest carbon footprint in the world, but critically, it's the region that's most dependent on hydroelectric power. Clean energy provides electricity for 70% of Brazil's needs, for example. And so, South America also has, lungs of our world, along with the rainforests in Central Africa and the Democratic Republic of Congo and Indonesia. But the key rainforest area of the world, arguably, is the Amazon, encompassing Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, parts of Bolivia, and parts of Venezuela. And so working with these countries on climate change should be a no-brainer. Again, I'm not particularly optimistic. Last year, we supplied Ukraine with $100 billion. Last year, for the entire Latin America, Caribbean, we supplied less than $3 billion of development assistance. We have not replenished World Bank development funding in the region. And it's unlikely we're going to do so in the future. On reshoring and nearshoring, not much has been done in terms of incentives. And it's always presented in terms of, this is good for you because you won't be dependent on China. That may be true, but the fact is, 21 countries in the region, I believe, their largest trading partner is China. And 4 or 5 have free trade agreements with China, including countries we're fairly close to, like Chile and Peru. And so, and more importantly, China's a major market for the exports of many of these countries. So as we look forward, I think it will be important to have more strategic engagement with Latin America and putting some resources in. Not just have the rhetoric, but have the commitment in terms of building more strategic economic ties, not next year, but over a period of 10 years, because it takes time to build these things out. But is the moment ripe for this kind of thing? It absolutely is. Is Latin America in a position to benefit what's a changing landscape globally? Yes, it is. Are there significant transformations underway? Yes, there are. And I would just add that this idea of Latin America just as a commodity producer, Latin America has unicorns in everything from the equivalence of Uber to cash payments to digital banking to medical record e-filing on medical records. It's an area that's undergoing a very significant transformation, and by now includes world-class hospitals, includes universities that are beginning to be listed on the best of lists in the world. It's a region that's transforming and needs to be looked at in different lens.
Thank you for that. I would like to stay on the topic of China just for a moment. You started to touch on the importance of China, especially with some of the countries for whom China is the largest trading partner. If you were to dig into the role of China more broadly in Latin America, what is it? How is it perceived? And how is it impacting U.S. relations with countries in the region?
So let me preface by noting 120 plus countries in the world, their largest trading partner is China. So when we focus on Latin America and speak of Latin America as though it's in thrall to China, that's not the way we speak about the relations other regions of the world have with China. In other words, China is a major factor in the global economy. It is a major trading partner for most Latin American countries. It doesn't follow that China is dominating local economies. When you're talking about $2 trillion economy in the case of Brazil, and Chinese foreign direct investment is in the $40 to $50 billion range, do the math. This is not a dominant position in Brazil. And Brazil has an extremely diversified set of export markets. So even though China is the largest trading partner, it's far from being the only trading partner. And we can go down the list. What I'm trying to suggest here is, yes, China is part of the landscape. So are we. And so is Canada. So are relationships with the European Union. In terms of ties with China, the ones that concern the United States most are investments in critical infrastructure, particularly telecommunications. And it's no secret to anybody that there is particular concern about Huawei and 5G. There's concern about investments in ports, particularly on the Pacific side of South America, and in energy grids in different countries. And so obviously these issues are discussed, but these governments are also aware of the importance of maintaining a balance and protecting their own infrastructure, and make very clear that that's what they do. The idea of debt indebtedness strategy with China, that's so yesterday. There hasn't been sovereign lending on any scale from China accepted by any place in Latin America since 2015, 2016. And so, we're near zero levels. In terms of development financing, last year, American development financing gave more to Latin America than the Chinese development banks. Chinese development banks, I think, in 2023 did less than $1 billion for the entire region, and most of it in Brazil. So this idea that debt entrapment is something that threatens most economies, it doesn't anymore. It did, but you're looking at places like Ecuador, which has not only renegotiated, but with the help of the United States, restructured and created a certain level of independence on its high level of indebtedness with China in the past. Same goes for Jamaica. And much of the reduction in dependency has been a reflection of very responsible macroeconomic policies being pursued by governments, whether they're left of center or right of center. And so as we look at this, is China a competitor in the region? Absolutely is. Our country is becoming overly dependent on China. We certainly, the United States, have raised concerns about certain sectors. And there's certainly concern about investments in critical minerals like lithium, copper, ports on the Pacific coast. But on balance, I would say Latin American governments as a whole tend to view China as another trading partner as opposed to a new hegemon in the region. A final statistic, the region owes somewhere around $130 to $140 billion to China. Almost $70 billion of that is owed by Venezuela, one country, and a country which just happens to be an authoritarian, left-leaning state, which is generating the largest flow of migrants in the history of Latin America, and has generated an economic collapse. Good luck to anybody collecting their debts from that government for the foreseeable future. So as we look at this, I'm not suggesting that Chinese investment and ties to the region aren't an issue that it is of concern to the United States government. What I'm trying to do is say it should be kept. We should look at it in context, and if we do, it doesn't look quite as daunting as sometimes seems.
That is some valuable perspective. Thank you. I'd be interested just to hear your take on whether and how security issues like migration and drug crime are shaping U.S. Latin America relations, and what are some realistic steps toward resolution?
So the short answer is you're absolutely right. They are shaping a significant proportion of ties between the United States and the region. On migration, let me start with the outflow from Venezuela, numbering anywhere between 5 and 7 million people out of a population of about 35 million over the last 5 or 6 years. The outflow of people from Haiti, the outflow of migrants again from Cuba. I think it's over 1 million in the last 4 years. There's certainly a migration crisis that's affecting the region. I say region, not just the United States. And I say this because if we take a look at where many of the migrants, particularly from Venezuela, go, but also from Haiti, also from other places, there's almost 3 million Venezuelans in Colombia. There's almost 1 million in Peru. There's 700,000 in Chile. In Ecuador, there's almost 1 million, and so on. And so as we look at this, what's interesting about the moment we're speaking in is how the migration crisis has become hemispheric, not just a question of the United States. The United States obviously remains the key draw for most migrant populations if they can get to the U.S. border, and we certainly have seen significant flows out of Central America continuing. I mentioned Cuba and Haiti, and certainly there's a growing number of Venezuelans that are heading for the United States border. But as the migration question is discussed between Latin America and the United States, very different from the way it would have been 10 years ago, because numerous countries are dealing with the challenge of irregular migration. I don't think I have to spell out for those of you, we all live in the United States. Migration is a serious political issue in the United States, and certainly the issue of millions of people coming across the border undocumented, both in the Trump administration and the Biden administration, is an issue of concern, and there are many suggestions on how border security can be achieved. In terms of dealing with Latin America on this question, however, we do need the cooperation, not just of Mexico, but of all countries. And we do want to see in countries that have challenging economic circumstances like Venezuela, certain Central American countries, that every opportunity to restore economic growth and opportunity for populations be taken. Right now, that's a bit of a challenge. And so I do believe with the continuing numbers trying to cross the border between Mexico and the United States, migration is going to remain a very significant issue for relations between the United States and the region. On fentanyl and drug trafficking, it's been a problem in my entire career in the State Department, going back to the 1980s. It's cyclical. We're in one of those moments where it's very serious again. But I would suggest, as we look at the fentanyl crisis in the United States, we also look at the challenges governments in Ecuador, in Mexico, in Colombia, in Brazil, in Venezuela even, are facing from transnational criminal organizations that are involved in much more than drug trafficking, whether it's extortion, whether it's legal sectors of the economy. Latin America, once again, is dealing with a very significant challenge to its institutionality from transnational organizations. And this is something I think which is of great concern to ordinary Latin Americans and certainly a concern to the United States. But if I can repeat something I said earlier, with all the other issues and pressing concerns around the world. We're not seeing much of a focus on resources or strategies to address these concerns. We'll have to see what happens after the election.
Well, that I think is a good place to leave off with the election top of mind. And I thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Global Insights. Voiceover host and editor for this episode is Casey Craig, with production support from Brian Thong. You can subscribe to Global Insights on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your audio. For more analysis, events, and ways to connect with our community, click on the link in the description. See you next time.